Thank you, thank you. The following is one of my voiceover demos. If you're a voiceover artist and you would like to advertise one of your demos on my podcast, please send an MP3 to thedrill12, all one word, at gmail.com. That's thedrill12 at gmail.com. Back in a minute.
Americans love scenery. We want to see it all, from one coast to the next, Mount Rushmore down to the Everglades. So hop into a Chevy Malibu and take the scenic route. It's the car you knew America could build. There's a place where people count on friendships they can trace back generations, where they can count on the same stool at the coffee shop waiting for them every morning. This place is called Glen Ellen, and you can find it in every bottle of Glen Ellen wine. This is craft brewed Herman Joseph's, the smoothest, easiest drinking specialty beer in the entire solar system. And I believe you'll find drinkable in the dictionary right after don't order a beer you can't drink. Zoingo! Boingo! The freestyle pogo with more boing, more bounce. Bounce further, bounce higher with Zoingo Boingo. To see what makes Arrowhead Mountain Spring water different from those other waters, you have to go back to the source. And with Arrowhead, that means going back a little farther and longer than most. Between security challenged and security strengthened, there's one important word: how. And it is the how that makes all the difference to our nation and our world. Lockheed Martin. We never forget who we're working for. What makes Kraft Singles so good? 2 out of every 3 kids don't get the recommended amount of calcium. But with Kraft Singles, they get a good source of calcium and the taste they love. Kraft Singles. Magic every single time. Throw boring overboard with a new real meal from Long John Silver's. A meal worthy of a plate, just $4.99. Only at Long John Silver's. We may not all be geniuses, but we can all do something smart. Introducing the Hyundai 199 Sonata Lease. It's a smart deal on a really smart car.
Two should not be joined together in holy matrimony. Let them speak now, or forever hold their peace.
Yes! I do.
The groom is already married.
He married me 3 years ago.
And don't let him deny it. I've got the marriage certificate to prove it. Oh, sorry. Wrong church. Two should not.
Good morning. It's Saturday, Wiker Saturday, September the 14th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have no free lunch, rules for radical conservatives, grow up, ideas have consequences, Bishop Barron, Ayn Rand, the 33 Strategies of War, and the 10 books every conservative must read. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
As he went along his way, saw plowing through the ragged skies, heading up the cloudy draw. Their brains were still on fire and their hooves were made of steel. Their horns were black and shiny and their hot breath he could feel. The bolt of fear went through him as they thundered through the sky, for he saw the riders coming hard, and he heard their mournful cry. Yippee-yi-oh, Ghost riders in the sky. Their faces gaunt, their eyes were blurred, their shirts all soaked with sweat. He's riding hard to catch that herd, but he ain't caught 'em yet, no. He ain't caught 'em yet. They gotta ride forever on that range up in the sky, on horses snorting fire. As they ride on to their cry. As the riders loped on by him, he heard one call his name. If you want to save your soul from hell, you're riding on the rain. That boy, change your ways today, or with us you will ride, trying to catch the devil's word across these endless skies. Yippee-yi-oh, Ghost riders in the sky. Ghost riders in the sky.
Thank you. And now, There's No Free Lunch, 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
The knowledge problem. Dispersed knowledge is essentially dispersed and cannot possibly be gathered together and conveyed to an authority charged with the task of deliberately creating order. F.A. Hayek. While Hayek's contributions to 20th century thought should never be limited to merely one quote, it is perhaps this basic notion of the knowledge problem that defines Hayekian thought at its finest. Building off of the Miscellaneous notion of human action, Hayek here says, essentially, that no central authority could ever gather the knowledge that is dispersed throughout society and individuals adequately enough to maintain order, let alone optimize prosperity. This basic reality of knowledge undermines the entire thesis of statism and should never be forgotten for any who desire a free and prosperous society.
And that was There's No Free Lunch. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now a little bit of rules for radical conservatives.
And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Except for the God part, pretty stirring stuff. But you wouldn't have the guts to do it again, would you? Even though the circumstances you now find yourselves in eerily and nearly exactly parallel the plight of those first white interlopers back in the 18th century. So in order to prevent something like, I don't know, a huge monolithic but brain-dead bureaucracy from taking over the country and making the lives of its free citizens miserable, they cobbled something together you like to call your Constitution. The Constitution. Everything you need to know, you learned in 1791. For all the oceans of ink that have been spilled, interpreting it, reinterpreting it, amending it, and best of all, even overturning portions of it, the Constitution is a ridiculously simple and straightforward document. Even with 27 mostly useless amendments added, it still runs barely 8,000 words, which is about half your average screenplay, such as Terminator Salvation, but funnier. What's more, the commentary three of the founders provided in the Federalist Papers, Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay, as they attempted to sell this crazy idea of limited self-government, is remarkable for the clarity of their writing and their dedication to their ideals. Gaia only knows what might have happened had Alexander Hamilton continued to proselytize on behalf of freedom. But luckily, the first Democratic Vice President, Aaron Burr, put a stop to that nonsense by shooting him dead in Weehawken. And that was the end of that. Face it, we killed your republic before it was hardly even born. God bless a political party's right to choose. Still, writing in sentences so simple that it takes a Yale-educated federal judge to willfully misunderstand them, the framers laid out the basic principles of life in a state where the government leaves you alone. As far as Hamilton et al. Were concerned, it wasn't the job of the federal government, or any government, to take care of you and your family, to ensure not just equality of opportunity, but equality of results, and to divvy the nation up into aggrieved and competing ethnic groups. Instead, it was as easy as 1, 2, 3. Article 1, and therefore by implication the most important one, concerns the legislature. All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and House of Representatives. That's pretty much it. Sure, the document goes on to explain the qualifications, age 25 for the House, 30 for the Senate, residency and citizenship requirements, but the key thing here is that you wingnuts should govern yourselves through the simple mechanism of electing a whole new House of Representatives every 2 years, with the senators being selected by the state legislatures, their terms staggered so that every 2 years, 1/3 of them can be replaced. Have you ever heard of anything so crazy? The Constitution is quite clear on what the enumerated powers of Congress are. Notice that nowhere on this list is the Environmental Protection Agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, or the Department of Education. Oversights that thankfully have since been corrected. Anyway, here's the list of stuff that Congress gets to do, right there in Section 8. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. But all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. To borrow money on the credit of the United States. To regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states, and with the Indian tribes. To establish a uniform rule of naturalization and uniform laws on the subject of bankruptcies throughout the United States. To coin money, regulate the value thereof and of foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures. To provide for the punishment of counterfeiting the securities and current coin of the United States. To establish post offices and post roads. To promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their representative writings and discoveries. To constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. To define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas and offenses against the law of nations. To declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water. To raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years.
And that was the next part of Chapter 25 from Rules for Radical Conservatives by David Kahane. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the book Grow Up, Life Isn't Safe, But It's Good by Dr. Everett Piper. And I've been going about this one from backwards, so to speak. I started with the last chapter last week, which was chapter 20, called Sit by the Exit Doors, and it was about leadership. So this one is lesson 19. There is no I in team.
company work, a society work, and a civilization
And by the way, it's 14 minutes long.
work. Vince Lombardi. All about me. The desire for celebrity status is pervasive. It's everywhere. For years, we've watched as the individual has become the focus of nearly every venue of life. The old athletic axiom, there's no I in team, has been traded for, hey, look at me. This mentality has produced terrible consequences for our society. Rather than being a band of brothers, we've become warriors in solitude. There's no more obvious evidence of this than higher education. If you don't believe there's a concerted effort to divide the nation, I have some oceanfront property in Nebraska I'd like to sell you today. The people responsible for this agenda push their message through cable news, newspapers, social media, and colleges and universities. They think that if they can get people to focus on themselves, their grievances, and their victimhood, that is, what divides them rather than unifies them, the very fabric of our nation can be taken apart strand by strand. Or as Solomon told us, a cord of 3 strands is not easily broken, but a cord of 1 is defenseless. In other words, divide and conquer. And this strategy is working. Just look at the divisive rhetoric of contemporary politics, or the transparent us against them agendas, otherwise known as intersectionality and critical race theory, that are rampant on college greens from coast to coast. Adults are acting like children, crying, "That's mine," or "You hurt my feelings." They're unashamed of throwing juvenile tantrums until someone gives in and strokes their little egos. They apparently do not even care that they are obviously being played like a banjo by those plucking the strings in Washington, Hollywood, and faculty lounges throughout the nation. Everywhere we look, we see calls for segregation rather than integration. Those seeking to control us shamelessly work to divide us by race, gender, sexual orientation, voting tendencies, economic status, nationality, height, weight, educational level, religion, age, and whatever else can balkanize us into competing groups with irreconcilable demands. In 1975, Ronald Reagan told Mike Wallace in an interview, "If fascism ever comes to America, it will come in the name of liberalism." This foresight of the great communicator has proven prescient. Indeed, ideological fascism has come to America, and it has come at the hand of progressives waving flags of safe spaces, microaggressions, trigger warnings, and victimization and vengeance on college campuses across the land. Under these flags, you see children from the ages of 18 to 80 throwing tantrums in the public square and demanding that we give them every plastic toy and piece of candy they want, or suffer the consequences of their wrath. When your God is diversity, unity will not be tolerated. If our priority is diversity, a second thing, we will never realize the first thing of unity. Diversity is self-centered. At its core, it divides. It is grounded in the premise of me against you and us against them. It's childish. It's selfish. It says, "Give me mine." It is the antithesis of Christ's admonition to die to self. Children are by nature individualistic and insular. They don't care much about anything other than themselves. They want what they want. Other people and their demands may never even cross their minds. Adults, to the contrary, have hopefully matured enough to understand that life isn't just about them. They see the wisdom of promoting unity rather than division, integration rather than segregation, us rather than me and mine, a united states rather than a divided states. Adults ought to care more about a common cause of personal righteousness than the divisive demands of our personal rights. Adults see the value of hundreds of hands working together rather than one person's hand clapping in midair. What would a symphony be if there was only one person playing a triangle and no other musicians or instruments? Adults see that the full orchestra makes the music that inspires us to consider things grander than ourselves. Adults understand that inspiration comes from outside, not inside. You don't inspire yourself. Something bigger and better and beyond you is always the source of your inspiration. Whenever we reverse the order and focus on second things, we neither get the first nor the second. It is only by dying to self, that is, setting aside our childish individualism, that any human being will ever find his true identity. True identity isn't found in race or gender. It isn't found in personal grievances or our narcissistic infatuations. As the Apostle Paul said, we are neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free. We are human beings, and selfless unity rather than self-centered demands is the first thing. Focusing on first things actually works. Evidence of this can be found in innumerable examples, from music to athletics, from government to marriage and family dynamics. But one seminal example is found in the Acts of the Apostles. In the earliest days of the church, growth was explosive. Why? Luke wrote this: all the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold their property and possessions to give to anyone who was in need. Christ was the focus of these first churches in Acts. The assembly included men and women, apostles and new converts. All of these people were from various socioeconomic backgrounds and nationalities, races and ethnic groups. There was clearly every potential for them to focus on their differences and what divided them. They could have started talking about diversity and multiculturalism. They could have started lecturing each other about critical race theory and intersectionality. They could have focused on how one group was privileged at the expense of another. But we hear none of that. Why? The answer is simple and quite clear. The first church understood the first thing. The body of Christ was more important than individual believers. Christ was more important than their individual complaints. Unity was more important than diversity. They sold what they have and gave it to others, not because they were socialists, but because of their Savior. They didn't give of their wealth because they thought everyone deserved their fair share. They gave all they had because they knew that no one, themselves included, deserves anything. Bottom line, they knew it wasn't about them. Professors, politicians, pundits, and even preachers do our nation great harm by enabling young people to miss the first things by fixating on those that are second. As Richard Newhouse warned, such ontological dyslexia only brings the profound bigotry and anti-intellectualism and intolerance and illiberality of liberalism. This enabling of perpetual adolescence and its fixation on me and mine is growing with each decade. It is stunting the development and growth of our kids and our culture. We are force-feeding our progeny with a steady diet of individualism and diversity rather than the higher ideas of sacrifice and unity. Why are we surprised to see a generation of self-centered adults frozen in childish claims of entitlement and demands for their fair share? We have set up those who follow us for failure by encouraging them to believe that their safety is more important than their neighbor's soul. We've taught them that they're entitled to everything rather than obligated to give anything. William Wilberforce suggested that this enabling of such misguided thinking is the antithesis of love. He said that if you love someone who is ruining his or her life because of faulty thinking, and you don't do anything about it because you're afraid of what others might think, it would seem that rather than being loving, you are in fact being heartless. This fixation on faulty thinking, that is, on second things, brings cries of microaggressions and calls for trigger warnings. It runs from the debate rather than toward it. It brings exclusion rather than inclusion, segregation rather than integration, and cries for comfort rather than accepting the challenges of confrontation. These deficiencies do not rectify themselves over time, but rather grow like a cancer with each passing year. The more the second things are highlighted, the less likely anyone will ever understand that they are not the first thing. But instead of encouraging people to grow up and think and act and give and serve like adults, our nation's brain trust thinks it's a good idea to bring in a herd of goats for our precious little snowflakes to pet so they can insulate themselves even further from any of the demands of life that might compromise their sense of self. Talk about faulty thinking. Over the past 30 years, I've had at least 15 different college students live with my family. These students became part of our family while they attended college. The majority of these kids were from different cultures, and some were even from different countries. In my house, unity, not diversity, has been our concern. We are a family, pure and simple. We see character, not color. We don't see age, nationality, nor social status. We celebrate what we have in common, and we don't worry about how we differ. We focus on the Savior and not the self. We hold each other accountable to righteousness, and we don't defend our rights. We are much more interested in what is good than what is safe. My family's identity is in Christ, not in individual grievances. Everyone under my roof is a man and a brother, nothing more and nothing less. There are no subdivisions. My home is a university, not a diversity. It's a place where everyone is expected to act like an adult and not behave like a child. My home is not a daycare. Our priority is to know and honor God, not to stand in line to pet goats. Forget what the proponents of diversity are telling you. They say they are striving to bring unity to all people, but their goal is to create further division with each passing day. They say they champion what brings us together, but in actuality, all they strive to do is to highlight the very things that divide us. Playing on race, they create a greater separation between people of different colors. Calling for bipartisanship, they castigate and cast out those who hold different beliefs and values. While claiming that they accept all people as they are, they reject those who do not conform. These progressives call for people to come together while finding pleasure in driving them further apart each day. But the historical vision for America is, in fact, the opposite. It is a vision of uniting rather than dividing. Our history is one of a people of different views who came together unified and with common purpose to fight for human dignity and freedom. What our founders held in common was of far greater value than any of their differences. They understood the paradox that the more a government focuses on what the individual is owed, the more all individuals will be owned by that government. Today, these foundational principles of freedom are clearly under attack by people who know very well that the way to more power is through more division. A cord of one strand can be broken. A cord of three cannot. Why divide when the strength of numbers offers greater odds of success? Why be satisfied with diversity when we can have unity? Why pet goats when we could actually be serving God? Strength is found in unity with one another and in the unity that we share in the body of Christ. Knowing that we are the Imago Dei leads us to see others as creations of God too. The followers of Christ welcome and include everyone of all backgrounds and races in the common bond. Adults see beyond the small differences. Every day we associate with those who pull for different sports teams. We speak and we fraternize with those who listen to different styles of music and different kinds of food. We know that when we stop talking about diversity and celebrate unity, we quickly forget ourselves and can think almost exclusively about others. Adolescents talk about their differences. They segregate. They divide. The irony, however, is that the second thing of the self is always self-defeating. If all you care about in life is getting your rights, your safe space, and your pound of flesh, if your focus is on little else besides your individuality and your identity, then you may get what you want in the end, but you may not like it. If your focus is on you, then you'll get it and little else. There's no I in team, and those that think there is always lose.
And that was Lesson 19, There's no I in team. From the book Grow Up, Life Isn't Safe, But It's Good by Dr. Everett Piper. And again, I go going backwards on this one, and I'm planning on doing it with other books as well, because too many of these authors want to start from the beginning. So it starts once upon a time, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, going through a history, and I'm not interested in that. I want the authors, to get to the point. Since they don't want to get to the point, I'm going to do it for them. Back in a minute. And now, the next part of Ideas Have Consequences.
How can men who disagree about what...
Let's put him on hold for a second there. Of Chapter 4 of Ideas Have Consequences.
The world is for, agree about any of the minutiae of daily conduct. The statement really means that it does not matter what a man believes, so long as he does not take his beliefs seriously. Anyone can observe that this is the status to which religious belief has been reduced for many years. But suppose he does take his beliefs seriously, then what he believes places a stamp upon his experience, and he belongs to a culture, which is a league founded on exclusive principles. To become eligible, one must be able to say the right words about the right things, which signifies in turn that one must be a man of correct sentiments. This phrase, so dear to the 18th century, carries us back to the last age that saw sentiment and reason in a proper partnership. That culture is sentiment refined and measured by intellect becomes clear as we turn our attention to a kind of barbarism appearing in our midst and carrying unmistakable power to disintegrate. This threat is best described as the desire of immediacy, for its aim is to dissolve the formal aspects of everything and to get at the superstitious reality behind them. It is characteristic of the barbarian, whether he appears in a pre-cultural stage or emerges from below into the waning day of a civilization. To insist upon seeing a thing as it is, the desire testifies that he has nothing in himself with which to spiritualize it. The relation is one of thing to thing without the intercession of imagination. Impatient of the veiling with which the man of higher type gives the world imaginative meaning, the barbarian and the Philistine, who is the barbarian living amid culture, demands the access of immediacy. Where the former wishes representation, the latter insists upon starkness of materiality, suspecting rightly that forms will mean restraint. There is no need to speak of Vandals and Goths, since our concern is with the vertical invasion of the barbarians in our own time. I shall cite an instance from the modern period and from the United States, so symbolical of the world of the future. The American frontiersman was a type who emancipated himself from culture by abandoning the settled institutions of the seaboard and the European motherland, reveling in the new absence of restraint. He associated all kinds of forms with the machinery of oppression which he had fled, and was now preparing to oppose politically. His emancipation left him impatient of symbolism, of indirect methods, and even of those enclosures of privacy which all civilized communities respect. De Tocqueville made the following observation of such freed men: as it is on their own testimony that they are accustomed to rely, they like to discern the object which engages their attention with extreme clearness. They therefore strip off as much as possible all that covers it. They rid themselves of whatever separates them from it. They remove whatever conceals it from sight, in order to view it more closely in the broad light of day. This disposition of mind soon leads them to contemn forms, which they regard as useless and inconvenient veils placed between them and the truth. The frontiersman was seeking a solvent of forms, and he found his spokesmen in such writers as Mark Twain, a large part of whose work is simply a satire upon the more formal European way of doing things. As the impulse moved eastward, it encouraged a belief that the formal was the outmoded, or at least the un-American. A plebeian distrust of forms, flowering in eulogies of plainness, became the characteristic American mentality. Has America vulgarized Europe, or has Europe corrupted America? There is no answer to this question, for each has its own way yielded to the same impulse. Europe, long ago, began the expenditure of its great inheritance of medieval forms, so that Burke, in the late 18th century, was sharply aware that the unbought grace of life was disappearing. America is responsible for the vulgarization of the old world, only in the sense that, like a forcing house, it brought the impulses to fruition sooner. It enjoys the dubious honor of a foremost place in the procession. Today, over the entire world, there are dangerous signs that culture, as such, is marked for attack because its formal requirements stand in the way of expression of the natural man. Many cannot conceive why form should be allowed to impede the expression of honest hearts. The reason lies in one of the limitations imposed upon man. Unformed expression is ever tending toward ignorance. Good intention is primary, but it is not enough. That is the lesson of the experiment of romanticism. The member of a culture, on the other hand, purposely avoids the relationship of immediacy. He wants the object somehow depicted and fictionized, or as Schopenhauer expressed it, he wants not the thing, but the idea of the thing. He is embarrassed when this is taken out of its context of proper sentiments and presented bare, for he feels that this is a reintrusion of that world which his whole conscious effort has sought to banish. Forms and conventions are the ladder of ascent, and hence the speechlessness of the man of culture when he beholds the barbarian tearing aside some veil which is half adornment, half concealment. He understands what is being done, but he cannot convey the understanding because he cannot convey the idea of sacrilege. His cries of ad beste profani are not heard by those who, in the exhilaration of breaking some restraint, feel that they are extending the boundaries of power or of knowledge. Every group regarding itself as emancipated is convinced that its predecessors were fearful of reality. It looks upon euphemisms and all the veils of decency with which things were previously draped as obstructions which it, with superior wisdom and praiseworthy courage, will now strip away. Imagination and indirection it identifies with obscurantism. The mediate is an enemy to freedom. One can see this in even a brief lapse of time, how the man of today looks with derision upon the prohibitions of the 1890s, and supposes that the violation of them has been without penalty. He would suffer poignant disillusion had he a clear enough pattern in his soul to be able to measure differences. But one consequence of this debauchery, as we shall see, is that man loses discrimination. For, when these veils are stripped aside, we find no reality behind them, or at best, we find a reality of such commonplaceness that we would willingly undo our little act of brashness. Those will realize, who are capable of reflection, that the reality which excites us is an idea, of which the indirection, the veiling, the withholding is part. It is our various supposals about a matter which give it meaning, and not some intrinsic property which can be seized in the bare-handed fashion of the barbarian. In a wonderfully prescient passage, Burke foretold the results of such positivism when it was first unleashed by the French Revolution. All the pleasing illusions which made power gentle and obedience liberal, which harmonized the different shades of life, and which, by a bland assimilation, incorporated into politics the sentiments which beautify and soften private society.
And that was the next part of Chapter 4 from Ideas Have Consequences by Richard Weaver. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the Daily Stoic.
Cutting back on the costly. So, concerning the things we pursue and for which we vigorously exert ourselves, we owe this consideration. Either there is nothing useful in them, or most aren't useful. Some of them are superfluous, while others aren't worth that much. But we don't discern this and see them as free when they cost us dearly. Seneca, Moral Letters, 42.6. Of Seneca's many letters, this is probably one of the most important and one of the least understood. He's making a point that goes unheard in a society of ever bigger houses and ever more possessions, that there's a hidden cost to all that accumulating, and the sooner we're aware of it, the better. Remember, even what we get for free has a cost, if only in what we pay to store it, in our garages and in our minds. As you walk past your possessions today, ask yourself, do I need this? Is it superfluous? What's this actually worth? What is it costing me? You might be surprised by the answers and how much we've been paying without even knowing it.
And that was the Daily Stoic by Ryan Holiday. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
In the Bible, Israel is the specially chosen people of God. God chose Israel to be his special priestly and prophetic people. Right. How come? So that they might be set apart from everybody else as God's unique focus of attention, so that they might be singled out of everyone to be saved? Well, no. He chooses Israel indeed. He singles them out indeed. Not for themselves, but for everybody else. He chooses Israel for the rest of humanity. And may I press it, he chooses Israel for the whole world. In other words, everybody, there's always a universal background to everything that God does with and for his people, Israel.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Ayn Rand thought of the day. Quote, capitalism has been called nationalistic, yet it is the only system that banished ethnicity and made it possible in the United States for men of various formerly antagonistic nationalities to live together in peace. Unquote. That was Ayn Rand from Global Balkanization from the book The Voice of Reason. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the 33 Strategies of War.
From Strategies of Psychotherapy by Jay Haley. It is impossible to win a contest with a helpless opponent, since if you win, you have won nothing. Each blow you strike is unreturned, so that all you can feel is guilt for having struck, while at the same time experiencing the uneasy suspicion that the helplessness is calculated.
And that was the 33 Strategies of War. Back in a minute. Thank you. And if you're a Democrat, you want to vote Republican because the late modern achievement subject is free, in that it does not encounter repression on the part of sovereign entities external to itself. But in reality, it is just as unfree as the obedient subject. Once exterior repression is overcome, pressure builds within. Thus, the achievement subject develops depression. The violence persists unabated. It merely shifts to the interior. The stages of the topological transformation of violence are decapitation in the sovereignty society, deformation in the disciplinary society, and depression in the achievement society. Violence is increasingly internalized, psychologized, and thus rendered invisible. More and more, it rids itself of the negativity of the other or the enemy, becoming self-referential. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, from the 10 books every conservative must read, we're going to finish the chapter, 33 minutes long, about the Jerusalem Bible.
Prophet, speaking in the name of Yahweh, says, "Look, I am going to send my messenger to prepare a way before me. And the Lord you are seeking will suddenly enter his temple, and the angel of the covenant, whom you are longing for. Yes, he is coming, says Yahweh Sabaoth." This entry will not be pleasant. Malachi is speaking of the dread day of Yahweh, when he will come to purge the temple. In Matthew, Jesus identifies the messenger with John the Baptist, and hence Yahweh with himself. Matthew chapter 11, verse 10. Of course, this prophetic utterance is the context for understanding Jesus' later stormy entrance into the temple, cleansing it of money changers. Matthew chapter 21, verses 12 through 14. There, he cures the blind and the lame. Yahweh restores sight to the blind. Psalm 146, verse 8. In response to these wonders, the children shout, "Hosanna to the Son of David," which makes the chief priests and scribes indignant. But Jesus answered, "Have you never read this? By the mouths of children, babes in arms, you have made sure of praise," which is a reference to Psalm 8. Yahweh our Lord, how great your name throughout the earth. Above the heavens is your majesty, chanted by the mouths of children, babes in arms. The temple dignitaries only want to accuse Jesus of taking on the title of kingly Messiah. Jesus does them one better by identifying himself with Yahweh. But the identity of Yahweh and Jesus in the story is even more mysterious, because it also includes the identity of Jesus as a Jew. Let's go to a few related scenes in the drama, starting with one of the strangest and most terrifying. Yahweh appears to the childless Abram, not yet renamed Abraham, in a vision, saying, "Have no fear, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward will be very great." But, Abram replies, "You have given me no descendants." Yahweh then promises him descendants that number as many as the stars, and the promised land itself. "My Lord Yahweh," Abram says, "how am I to know that I shall inherit it?" Genesis chapter 15, verses 2 through 6. Yahweh's response is a frightening ancient ritual. We cannot approach this scene from our world. We must enter a world in which a man's vow was considered absolutely sacred and binding, a thing so serious that only bloody sacrifice could seal it. Yahweh has Abram get a heifer, a goat, a ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon, and cut them in half. In this ritual, two men make a covenant, a binding promise, by each walking between the split carcasses of animals, calling down upon themselves the same gruesome fate if they break their vows. Abram does as he is told, but for some reason doesn't cut the birds in half. And then he waits. Birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them off. And still he waited until, as the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and terror seized him. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, there appeared a smoking furnace and a firebrand that went between the halves. Genesis chapter 15, verses 7 through 18. We must wait there with Abram and imagine ourselves the witnesses of a ghastly and ominous scene. But what can this dark and horrible scene mean? How could Yahweh enter a two-sided covenant, one that seemed to imply that he could be slaughtered if he doesn't fulfill his end of it? And why didn't Abram walk through? At this point in the story, it is all a complete mystery, but that is exactly how stories work. Perhaps an even more horrifying scene takes place when this same deity commands Abraham to slaughter his own son Isaac on an altar, and then burn up the corpse as if he were making a food offering of a sacrificial animal. Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 through 19. What kind of a God would ask a man to sacrifice his son? Of course, that was precisely what many of the pagan deities did. Even as a kind of test of Abraham's fidelity to Yahweh, or perhaps especially as a kind of test, it seems not only barbaric, but even more contradictory. since it is through Isaac that the promises to Abraham have been made. Kill Isaac, and the covenant promise of endless descendants is killed as well. And here we must understand that the same voice, the same powerful vision with the same irresistible authority that revealed to Abram that he would be blessed through this son, also said, "Take your son, your only child Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. There you shall offer him as a burnt offering on a mountain I will point out to you." Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 and 2. What can it mean? How can Yahweh ask such a thing? Many centuries later, Israel has been dragged into exile, torn from the promised land, abandoned by Yahweh for breaking the covenant. Yet to these Jews in Babylon, the prophet Isaiah speaks words of unimaginable hope. A voice cries, "Prepare in the wilderness a way for Yahweh." Isaiah chapter 40, verse 1. Israel herself, the servant of Yahweh, is crushed in exile, nearly torn in two. "See, my servant will prosper. He shall be lifted up, exalted, rise to great heights," Yahweh promises through the inspired Isaiah. But then, the crowds were appalled on seeing him. So disfigured did he look that he seemed no longer human, a thing despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering, a man to make people screen their faces. He was despised, and we took no account of him. And yet ours were the sufferings he bore, ours the sorrows he carried. But we thought of him as someone punished, struck by God and brought low. Yet he was pierced through for our faults, crushed for our sins. On him lies a punishment that brings us peace, and through his wounds we are healed. Isaiah chapter 52, verse 13 through chapter 53, verse 5. In the New Testament story, the various seeming contradictions and mysteries are resolved, if even in a greater mystery. We now understand why only Yahweh passed between the bloody carcasses. In the flesh, Jesus is the descendant of Abraham, and mercifully takes upon himself, as a Jew, the terrible punishment that results from Israel breaking her side of the covenant. Yet he is Yahweh. The plot thickens even more. Jesus, Yahweh saves, is revealed as the Son of the Father. We therefore find out what kind of a deity could ask that a man's only son be slaughtered as a way to fulfill the covenant and open up the promised land. At the same time, he bears the full punishment for breaking the covenant. It is not accidental that the crucifixion takes place on a hill, that Jesus carries his cross as Isaac carried wood up the mountain for his own sacrifice, and that the same kind of eerie darkness accompanies the crucifixion as the original bloody covenant between Yahweh and Abram. But since this is a masterful story, we have only begun to touch the multiple strands of meaning that unfold in the plot, the prophecies, the details of kingship, the wisdom literature that leads to the incarnation of wisdom itself. Note one important thing about all this. On the literary level, all these connections are in the text. In one sense, it doesn't matter whether we believe them. To understand the Bible as a story, all that matters is that we follow out all the connections and discover the full meaning intended. But of course, the obvious question is it a true story, or is it a fairy story, or is it both? Is the Bible a fairy story? It is certainly right to call the Bible a fairy story in Tolkien's sense of the term, for it is a great adventure filled to overflowing with the fantastic. As with Dickens's A Christmas Carol, which I think qualifies as one of the greatest modern fairy stories, our experience of its truths depends on how deeply we experience the story as real. In fact, the most salutary effect of A Christmas Carol is that we wish ghosts did come to haunt the near-damned. We'd all be a lot better off. With the Bible, there is this difference, the difference. It is the one fantastic story that actually happened. In this case, story is history. We need to experience the Bible as real through our imagination, and then realize that much of what we have just read testifies to actual incidents that truly occurred, and that are as well recorded as many other historical events of the ancient world that we take for granted. But note the movement. First, we lose ourselves in the story, just as we would any other great story, like a Christmas carol. Second, we are hit, slowly or suddenly, with the truths revealed through the story. And then third, we realize that in fact, what we have just read is in large part an historical account. I stress in large part. The Bible is written from a variety of styles and angles, using straight-out description, metaphor, parables, proverbs, poetry, and didacticism. The ancient Jews, like most ancient people, were not history journalists in the modern sense. For them, the way one describes what really happened needs to reflect the full complexity of what really happened and their understanding of it. And sometimes, as often happens with fairy stories, that requires poetry rather than prose, or a parable rather than a descriptive paragraph. And so, perhaps we can be somewhat less shocked at Tolkien saying that the Gospels contain a fairy story, or a story of a larger kind which embraces all the essence of fairy stories. But this story has entered history and the primary world. There is no tale ever told that men would rather find was true, and one which so many skeptical men have accepted as true on its own merits. For the art of it has the supremely convincing tone of primary art, that is, of creation. To reject it leads either to sadness or to wrath. It is not difficult to imagine the peculiar excitement and joy that one would feel if any specially beautiful fairy story were found to be primarily true, its narrative to be history, without thereby necessarily losing the mythical or allegorical significance it had possessed. But this story, in the Gospels, is supreme, and it is true. Art has been verified. God is the Lord of angels and of men and elves. Legend and history have met and fused. We end this section on an obvious note, and a sour one at that. The modern case against fairy stories in general, and the Bible in particular, is that miracles cannot happen. Fantastic things are impossible, we are told. Therefore, the Bible is a fairy story in the worst sense. It is the one fairy story which, in most foolish pretense, claims to be true, and hence is most laughable. Miracles cannot happen, the materialists tell us, because all events are materially determined. Of course, materialists, by the same argument, say that we don't exist, at least not in the way that you or I think we do, as thinking, conscious, acting beings, rather than as a series of biochemical reactions. More important in this context, though, is the circular confusion in the skeptical materialists' reasoning. The claim that miracles do not happen is based upon the assumption that they cannot happen. That is entirely non-scientific, arguing not from evidence, but ideology. The real question is whether miracles do happen. If they do occur, then our science would have to include that fact, even if it can't explain it. That is basically what happens when, in the Catholic Church's investigations into the cause of canonization of a saint, every effort of the latest science is bent on proving the non-miraculous nature of alleged miracles. Once we accept that miracles can and do happen, the fantastic in the Bible is no longer an obstacle to our understanding the story as real. We might even wonder if the explicit rejection of the miraculous has, at its source, not evidence that miracles are impossible, but the deep desire to deny the reality of the biblical story. The story of liberalism versus the biblical story. Readers should not think that I've stepped beyond the themes of this book. At its heart, liberalism is secular. That is, it rejects the possibility that the Bible is a true story, and does so on two related grounds: that materialism, which liberalism generally accepts, forbids the miraculous, and that religion, especially the religion of the Bible, is dangerous, leading to war and a morbid preoccupation with otherworldly heaven and hell, when we should be thinking of this worldly comfort and peace. Ironically, in rejecting Christianity, it takes over its themes. Consequently, the story of liberalism is a story of progress away from religion through the ministrations of miracle-producing science toward a world of peace, comfort, and plenty, a kind of New Eden. It is, if we compare it to the Bible, the great anti-biblical fairy story, filled with tales of astounding scientific discoveries that manifest a new kind of magic power over nature, and promises of even more fantastic magic in the utopian future. Not surprisingly, this secular utopianism self-consciously inverts the biblical relationship of creature to creator. Liberalism, as fundamentally secular, sees itself as fundamentally creative, and human beings as raw material to be recreated. Liberalism is, then, perhaps less fairy story than science fiction. The liberal goal is utopia, the brave new world, where man is not created in the likeness of God, but rather man can be recreated in whatever likeness he pleases, if he wields sufficient technical power. In this utopia, good and evil are not objective, but each can define them for himself. In the liberal anti-biblical story, moral evil is not the violation of human nature as defined by a creator, but the suppression of any human desire, any desire as defined by the individual. Since goodness in this story is defined by what I desire, the point of government, and even religion as it is co-opted by liberalism, is to satisfy whatever desires individuals happen to have. There are other essential differences between the biblical and liberalism's stories. In the Bible, human social life does not begin in a state, but in a family, with the union of male and female, so intimately designed for each other that they become as one flesh. In this fusion of two into one, a child is created. Everything good for human beings that comes after depends upon this fundamental union. Anything that is evil in some way violates and profanes it. The central importance of this familial origin is seen clearly in the precedence that family has throughout the story. Yahweh does not make nations from social contracts or abstract principles. He does not make Israel from even Jews, but from Abraham and Sarah. Marriage is so important, so primary, that it is the main metaphor Yahweh uses in relationship to Israel. He, the bridegroom, Israel, the bride. His demand of obedience takes the form of a demand for marital fidelity. The incarnation occurs not in the sudden appearance of a resplendent and terrifying king, but in a stable as the baby in the family of Mary and Joseph. When this child is, upon growing up, asked about the negation of marriage and divorce, he responds, "Have you not read that the Creator from the beginning made them male and female, and that he said, 'This is why a man must leave father and mother and cling to his wife, and the two become one body? They are no longer two, therefore, but one body. So then, what God has united, man must not divide.'" Matthew chapter 19, verses 4 through 6. This is not merely a denial of divorce as allowed by religious leaders. It is a denial of the right of any man or the state to transgress the nature of marriage. For our purposes, it is important to note that the family is prior to the state in every sense. Again, we have the opposite flow in liberalism. From its inception in Thomas Hobbes, the twin foci of liberalism have been the individual and the state, both to the exclusion of the family. Whereas the Bible quite naturally considers individuals to come from families, and the nation as something that grows from families, liberalism begins with individuals and the state as if actual natural families were a kind of bothersome afterthought, or even an interference with the desires of individuals and the designs of the state. One ill effect of this has been the ironic liberal notion that the state is just one big family, a way of offsetting the equally unpleasant effects of considering the state to be a mere collection of isolated, desire-driven individuals. The elevation of the individual above the family has another interesting effect: blindness to the obvious fact that there is no such thing as an abstract, nondescript, asexual individual. There are only very concrete males and females. Individuals do not get married, men and women do. Individuals do not have children, fathers and mothers do. Children are not individuals, they are boys and girls. The liberal war against the natural distinction between the sexes and the natural family is the result of its elevation of the entirely artificial, abstract individual. To keep those individuals in check, the liberal needs power, and liberals believe that knowledge and technical mastery are tools to achieving power. Conservatives take a more biblical view. They believe that the beginning of knowledge is the fear of Yahweh, or to put it another way, knowledge comes from understanding and respecting the natural moral order as defined by the Creator. The biblical passage, "The fear of Yahweh is the beginning of knowledge. Fools spurn wisdom and discipline," Proverbs chapter 1 verse 7, cannot be read as a mere familiar bromide. Rather, it must be understood as a real fear, the proper reaction of coming to direct experience of an all-powerful being, the all-powerful being. This is such an essential point about the nature of biblical revelation, and hence the question of how we should read the Bible, that we must pause for its further consideration. I realize that our imaginations are feeble, that the power of revelation is hard to grasp, but to read the Bible, we need to imaginatively recreate the experience of the story. When we read, "Yahweh said to Abram, 'Leave your country, your family, and your father's house, for the land I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name so famous that it will be used as a blessing.'" Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 2. The voice or vision must be understood to have been of such personal authority and power that it penetrated straight to the marrow of Abraham's soul. He was immediately and completely drawn into the presence of a greater reality, such that, when the vision and voice faded and he slipped back into the everyday, his normal existence seemed paltry, cheap, a mere mist by comparison. Just the kind of experience of transcendence that C.S. Lewis reported, only far more powerful. Throughout the Old Testament, Yahweh speaks with this authority. It is the presence of this same authority that explains why the fishermen apostles dropped their nets and followed Jesus. The moral contours of the Bible come from the extraordinary experience of the presence of Yahweh. The point with Moses coming down with the tablet from Mount Sinai is not that a very loud and ostentatious deity is handing down a cleanup list of thou shalts and thou shalt nots. The moral response comes from the revelatory encounter with Yahweh. In such encounters, Yahweh is felt, is known as the supreme and only important object of desire, to use Lewis's phrase about his own glimmer of transcendent joy. In political terms, that means that we should have no other gods, like an omnipotent state, before Yahweh. But that is exactly what liberalism seeks to do, to put the state in the place of God. To liberals, a God above the state is too dangerous. Transcendence must not be allowed. We can trace a direct line of liberal animosity to biblical revelation from the 17th century to our own day. 17th and 18th century liberals like Thomas Hobbes, Benedict Spinoza, John Locke, and the deists permitted religion as an obsequious servant of the state. This quite naturally led to a religion of the state in the 19th and 20th centuries, a worship of the state as the bearer of all meaning, purpose, and human fulfillment. The elevation of the state as a secular religious idol is historically the result of denying that God revealed himself in history, and that this revelation puts in perspective and judges all human political activity beneath it. This brings us again to the question of morality. In the Bible, the experience of God as pure and as holy results in the human quest for purity and holiness. That is why the Ten Commandments begin with our relationship to God and then go on to our relationship with other human beings. The bridge between these two types of commandments, religious and moral, is that we are somehow made in the image of Yahweh. We do not kill, but love our neighbor, because somehow our neighbor is made in the image of the supreme and only important object of desire. It is in worshiping God that we keep from killing our neighbor as we would any other animal. In our own very secular time, of course, the reverse is happening. We are increasingly treating human beings as mere animals. I refer here not only to the horrific butcheries conducted by the National Socialists and Communists of the 20th century, putting human beings on cattle cars to be slaughtered, but to the similarly insidious insinuations of the same thinking in so-called progressive democracies, putting down people when they get old, sick, or inconvenient, getting ourselves spayed and neutered, thinking about human procreation in terms of breeding fit or unfit specimens. Christianity claims that man is a creature standing somewhere between God and mere animals. Liberalism proceeds to make him an animal, and in doing so, sets him free to treat himself however he wants. There is no sin. The liberal denial of sin and its effect on the political realm contrasts sharply with the biblical story. The overall drama of the Old Testament is tragic. The Jews are a chosen people and promised a land of milk and honey. Yet despite their best efforts, human sin keeps them from setting themselves up permanently and blissfully in the promised land. It is not that Israel itself is especially bad, or that its forms of government are worse than others. Rather, the lesson of the Bible is that if the chosen people cannot bring about a political promised land because of the ravages of sin, then no one will be able to create a political utopia. If God himself, as incarnate king, declares that his kingdom is not of this world, then no merely human attempt to establish a heaven on earth is possible. Here we see Vogelin's point about modern liberalism as a Christian heresy, Christianity without God. Liberalism assumes that there is no fundamental defect in the human soul, but that what ails us can be cured by some new kind of political arrangement, or by a hitherto unprecedented application of technical or political power. The state becomes the redeemer, and the heady assumption is that the state cannot sin. The practical effect, of course, is that those who actually wield political power are given license to act as if they could not sin. All actions are justified if they are directed to bringing about an earthly political utopia. The Bible tells a quite different story, one that, after the horrors of the 20th century, should seem eminently wise to even the greatest skeptics. Conservative wisdom and biblical wisdom. We can see, I hope, the obvious connections between biblical wisdom and conservative wisdom. That does not mean, of course, that the two are to be identified. Conservative wisdom is open to all human beings as human. It is, we might say, natural wisdom. That is why it is found among the ancient Jews and the ancient Greeks, and why the Jewish wisdom literature bears so many striking connections to other ancient Near East wisdom literature, as well as to things we find in Confucius or the Stoics. While the wisdom found in the Bible includes natural wisdom, it also reveals truths about the source of that wisdom that exceed our merely human capacities to discover, and in great part to fully understand. That is why the Bible can never be reduced to conservatism, even while it may act to clarify and reinforce conservatism's principles. Recovering biblical wisdom will certainly aid the conservative cause, but must never be identified with it. Conservative wisdom is open to all, because it is natural wisdom, human wisdom, the wisdom available to our natural powers of understanding. Since God is the creator of nature, including human nature as made in the image of God, biblical wisdom includes conservative wisdom, but rises far beyond to divine wisdom. The Bible contains both kinds of wisdom, as the wisdom literature well illustrates. It doesn't seem to take any kind of special revelation to grasp much that is found in Proverbs. Gathering in summer is the mark of the prudent. Sleeping at harvest is the sign of the shameless. Chapter 10, verse 5. Or, worry makes a man's heart heavy. A kindly word makes it glad. Chapter 12, verse 25. Or, a worker's appetite works on his behalf. His hungry mouth drives him on. Chapter 16, verse 26. These are wise words gathered through ordinary experience, the watchwords of prudence. Yet we also find in Proverbs wisdom being personified, calling aloud in the streets and at the city gates for people to come to her. Chapter 1, verses 20 through 33. You ignorant ones, study discretion, and you fools, come to your senses. Chapter 8, verses 3 to 5. She promises, I love those who love me. Those who seek me eagerly shall find me. Chapter 8, verse 17. Wisdom is personified as created by Yahweh before the oldest of his works, and in the creation of all else, wisdom reveals, I was by his side, a master craftsman, delighting him day after day. Chapter 8, verses 22 to 31. The wisdom by which nature was created calls everyone to a banquet. Come and eat my bread, drink the wine I have prepared. Leave your folly, and you will live. Walk in the ways of perception. Chapter 9, verses 5 to 6. Wisdom is the food of the soul, personified as a kind of active presence in creation, portrayed as feminine and a creature to distinguish it from Yahweh. Yet it is also understood as embodied in the law, as Baruch later makes clear when speaking of God the Creator. It is He who is our God. No other can compare with Him. He has grasped the whole way of knowledge and confided it to His servant Jacob, to Israel His well-beloved, so causing her to appear on earth and move among men. Baruch chapter 3, verses 36 to 38. Baruch is speaking here of the revealed law, the wisdom of God made known to the Jews, and the self-revelation of Yahweh. That is why he can use the feminine she. In Ecclesiasticus, or Sirach, Jesus ben Sirach unites God's creative wisdom and the law in one personification. He has her proclaim, "They who eat me will hunger for more. They who drink me will thirst for more." Chapter 24, verse 21. God's wisdom is infinite. There is always more. Insofar as we understand all these passages as merely poetic, as metaphors meant to vivify the deep appreciation of the Jews for the wisdom of God found in creation, we shall remain in the realm of natural or conservative wisdom. Insofar as we begin to grasp the active presence of wisdom in God's revealed law, and the way it fills the soul with a wisdom deeper than natural and moves history towards some mysterious and fantastic culmination, we are going beyond natural to supernatural wisdom, and hence what can be claimed as conservative wisdom available to all. The New Testament takes us even further beyond, to what quite properly shocked the Jews, the incarnation of what was meant as a poetic, metaphorical stretch to capture the ineffable in Yahweh. With the incarnation, as the beginning of the Gospel of John reveals, wisdom becomes flesh, appears on earth, and moves among men, not as a woman, but a son. Even stranger and more mysterious, the metaphorical picture of eating wisdom, wisdom as the life-giving food of the soul offered at a banquet, "Come and eat my bread, drink the wine I have prepared," is made flesh as well. Jesus declares of himself, as wisdom actually personified, "I am the bread of life. He who comes to me will never be hungry. He who believes in me will never thirst." Here is God's wisdom made flesh. There is no wisdom beyond, real flesh. With the incarnation, the metaphorical becomes actual. I tell you most solemnly, if you do not eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you will not have life in you. Anyone who does eat my flesh and drink my blood has eternal life, and I shall raise him up on the last day. For my flesh is real food, and my blood is real drink. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood lives in me, and I live in him. John chapter 6, verse 35, verses 53 to 56. Here, we have entered a realm of supernatural wisdom, an otherworldly kingdom, into which mere conservative wisdom cannot enter without the transformations effected by divine grace.
And that was the end of the chapter from about the Jerusalem Bible, 10 books every conservative must read, plus 4 not to miss, and 1 imposter by benjamin-wiker-phd. Back in a minute. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you that you are not neutral and that the government has no rights.